Welcome to the Hangout Podcast. I'm your host, David Sharetta. Come on in and hang out. In this episode, I was privileged to have a conversation with internationally acclaimed author and scholar, Dr. Reza Aslan. Dr. Aslan wrote No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam 20 years ago. He also wrote Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, God, A Human History, and An American Martyr in Persia. This conversation is wide-ranging. We had a fascinating exploration about what happens when a scholar writes a best-selling book, what that does to a career in academia. Spoiler alert, it's not great for that career. We talked about what is happening with the impact of the internet on Islam worldwide in terms of the flattening and the democratization of the religion and edicts and fatwas and much, much more. I was fascinated by our conversation, and I hope you are as well. Welcome, Dr. Aslan. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation today.
Oh, thanks for having me, David. It's great to be here.
I thought we could get started with the most logical place to start, which is with your origin story, where you come from, and what are the currents in your life that bring you to this moment, and then we'll dive into your writing.
Sure. I was born in Iran. My family fled the Iranian Revolution in 1979, so I was about 7 years old at the time. And, looking back on that, it was a pretty formative experience for me. I have a fairly clear memory of the 2 years or so during which that revolution took place, and was really aware of what was going on, what the stakes were for this revolution, which has been, I think, mischaracterized for much of the last 40 years as a quote-unquote Islamic revolution, but which was anything but that. It was an anti-imperialist revolution that brought every sector of Iranian society together. My father, who was a communist and an ardent atheist, who had a very healthy dislike of anything religious, kind of saw the writing on the wall in the post-revolutionary chaos and thought that it might be a good idea to get out for a bit until things settled down. So we came to the U.S. Things obviously didn't settle down in Iran, so we ended up just staying here. But I think that experience gave me a real fascination with religion and the way that religion can transform a society for good and for bad. And so I think growing up, even though I didn't come from a religious family at all, I think we were sort of, culturally Muslim the way so many people are culturally religious until we came to the US. And then that became the excuse to just kind of strip ourselves of any kind of religiosity. But I had always been really fascinated by it, by myth and by origin stories and by religious phenomenon and spirituality. In high school, I went to an evangelical youth camp and heard the gospel story for the first time. That was kind of I'd say the second formative experience of my life, and converted to this very conservative brand of evangelical Christianity. And then when I went to college, I decided that I would study religion. I was very good at it. It was really interesting. And it didn't take long for me to be confronted with the fact that almost everything I understood, not just about Christianity, but about religion, was wrong. And that was, I'd say, the third formative experience of my life. And I became even more fascinated by ideas of belief and identity, and decided that I was just going to dedicate my life to these concepts. It's been a fun, crazy, somewhat tumultuous journey ever since.
Thank you for sharing that. I, in doing a little bit of research on your life, I had learned about the Islam, Christianity, Islam from a religious scholarship standpoint, kind of.
Yeah.
I don't know if I want to call it flip flop because that's not the right word, but it's a different signposts in your life, different transitions. Um, I just was curious, like, did you see those as being so opposite, or was it like adjustments of a few degrees on the ship, like from
That's a really good
what you grew
question.
up with to then the Christianity to where you are now?
That's a really good question. And I guess the answer is yes and no. So yes, in the sense that what evangelical Christianity brought to me was the idea of spirituality and spiritual edification, right? This constant notion of striving for a personal relationship with God. And that was something that didn't really exist in the Islam that I grew up with. Um, and then the flip side of that, however, is that the heart of Christianity is this idea that the God of heaven and earth is just a man,
Hmm.
and a man who lived in a particular time and space. And there's this kind of over familiarity in evangelical Christianity. The God of heaven and earth, the creator of the universe, is your buddy, is your
Hmm.
friend. You can pal around with him. And honestly, that it never worked for me. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was my childhood, Jungian experience of thinking about God as wholly other, which is how he is defined in Islam. That it always bugged me. It never worked for me. And I think in the end, that was a big part of, I think, why it never stuck, why evangelical
Hmm.
Christianity never stuck. Indeed, what I rarely talk about is that there was a bridge between evangelical Christianity and me returning to a particular mystical brand of Islam, and that bridge was Catholicism. I went to a Jesuit university, and for the first time in my life, I experienced a different kind of Christianity, a Christianity in which God isn't your buddy, a Christianity in which awe is at the center of the experience of the divine. And that felt much more comfortable and real to me. And then fundamentally, I think the return to Islam had a lot to do with the metaphor at the heart of Christianity, which is God. If you want to understand the greatest mystery in the universe, it's pretty easy. Just think about the most perfect man you can think of, and that's God. And that's not the metaphor that really hit me. The metaphor that hit me was one that was offered to me by Sufi Islam. And the metaphor is the concept of oneness, the idea that God is about as unlike human beings as it possibly gets, right? That
Hmm.
whatever else God is, he is utterly unhuman like. Um, and indeed, he doesn't have a body. He doesn't have a personality. He doesn't have characteristics. He is pure creative force. And that's also, by the way, just a metaphor. These are all metaphors, right? It's just, which
Right.
metaphor hits you more? And that's the metaphor that I always kind of gravitated towards.
I'd imagine there were some interesting family conversations between you and your folks, right? Immigrant family and
Yeah.
a new country, societal pressures, societal perhaps discrimination or misunderstandings. I mean, that must have been interesting,
Well, there was certainly a lot of pressures and misunderstandings. And I mean, of course, this was, we came to the United States right before the Iran hostage crisis. So there
right?
was an enormous
Right.
amount of anti-Iranian and anti-Muslim sentiment. And, we were more than happy to just kind of hide our identity as either of those things.
Right.
It's funny. People always ask, oh, were your parents upset that when you converted to Christianity? Um, Yes, but not for the reasons that you think. My father was upset at me not because I had abandoned, the religion of my forefathers for a different religion. He was upset at me because I was religious, that any religion, as far as he was concerned, was problematic. Um, and then when I said that I was going to, basically study this as a living, I think there was a lot of confusion about that as a path. But it's worked out okay. They've
So,
gotten they've gotten used to the idea.
so his reaction was more almost just almost a I don't know if I want to call it a political reaction, but a reaction to what he was leaving behind in Iran, right? With an ultra conservative regime having taken over.
And indeed, I remember what he said. It was something along the lines of, "We came here so you wouldn't have to be religious."
Mm,
And I think it was hard for him to understand that. No, actually, I'm choosing this. This is no one's forcing this upon me. I'm choosing it. And I think the world that he grew up in, that was a strange idea.
right. There was no separation of church and state in the
Yes,
world he grew
although
up in, on some level, probably, right?
yeah, I mean it's a little bit different. I think this is one of the probably the biggest misconceptions of Islam, or even sort of
Mm,
Muslim majority states, and you hear it a lot from
yeah.
Americans, that the problem with these sort of Muslim majority countries is that there's no separation of, quote,
Mm,
mosque and state. And what's funny about that statement is, while it's true of, say, Saudi Arabia or
mhm,
Iran post revolution, it certainly wasn't true Iran pre-revolution. On the contrary, like the idea of public displays of religion, particularly in politics or activism or social movements, was violently suppressed, and that's still the case in the majority of Muslim, majority states. Where there isn't a separation of church and state? In America. That's where there is
yeah.
no separation of church and state. We literally, I mean, yes, we have this anti-establishment law that says, well, your taxes can't go to support any church. But the
Right.
truth is, because no religion pays any taxes, our taxes go to pay for every religion in the United States.
Mm,
In the United States, it's inconceivable to run for high office, certainly for president,
yeah.
if you cannot speak the language of religion, even if you are the most irreligious human being on earth, like the current president. Um, Whereas in, say, Egypt, if you are running for office and you start putting your arguments in terms of the Quran, you're never heard from again. That's the
Mm,
last time anyone sees you. So it's,
interesting.
this idea is it's a little bit more complicated than I think sometimes it
Yeah.
gets.
Yeah. And now that you said it in those terms, in my world as a school leader, we're in a charter school leader, we saw a vote of actually it wasn't they never voted. The Supreme Court split on let's see, did they vote or not? They did, but they one member recused herself because of a conflict of interest, but they were one vote away from approving a Catholic charter school
Hmm.
somewhere in the South this past year. And so, this had been appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, and I was watching the case and thinking, wow, if Justice Coney Barrett
Yeah,
doesn't have that conflict of interest, it might have gone 5-4, and the Supreme Court has endorsed public monies for a religious charter school. So
that's
I
right.
stand corrected on my on that part of it. Let's dive into the 20th anniversary of your seminal work. Well, why don't you just kind of set the stage for the writing of No God But God? I really was reflecting on like how the world was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Time to dive into the topic. And so, why don't you set the stage for how this idea came about and what the writing was like and what the reach of the book has been in the
Yeah.
ensuing 20 years?
It's funny. I mean, look, there's this anniversary of No God But God has brought up a whole host of emotions. One of which is this sort of confusion, because I'm also a teacher. I teach college, and my students have no connection whatsoever to 9/11. Like, they read about 9/11 the way that, like, you and I read about Pearl Harbor. It's kind of an
Right.
interesting turning point in history, you know.
Yeah.
But I mean, you remember, and I remember, like
Ah,
it was apocalyptic. Like I thought this
yeah.
was, the end of everything. Um, and obviously, there was, as we all remember, this incredible amount of not just demonization, but sort of misinformation and mischaracterization about Islam as a religion, and sort of going along the lines of what we were talking about with regard to the idea of the separation of church and state, a real kind of doubling down on Americans at a very confusing time, even pre 9/11, figuring out that, oh, we could actually now define ourselves, define what it means to be American simply by creating an imaginary opposite, an
Mm,
imaginary negative pole that we can define ourselves against. Let's just call it Islam and we'll call ourselves the West, even though those two categories are utterly nonsensical. Like, what is the West? That makes
right.
no sense whatsoever. If there is a West, guess what religion arose out of the West? Islam. And on the flip side of
Mm,
that, there's no such thing as Islam. Like, there's Islams. This is the second largest religion in the world, nearly 2 billion adherents. It comes in 1,000 flavors. And so the idea that you could call something Western civilization and something else Islamic civilization was both
mm,
utterly idiotic, and yet it had become foundational to
mm,
understanding the dawn of the 21st century. And I think that, when I sat down to write this book, that was my principal goal, was to shatter that simple dichotomy, the sort of the clash of civilizations narrative that had completely taken hold on all sides of the political spectrum in the United States, and instead to sort of present this religion, not positively or negatively, but as just a religion. I think that was honestly and truly what I think was probably the most revolutionary part about this book, and why it became such a global phenomenon, is that the argument of the book is that there's nothing all that unique or extraordinary or different about Islam. It's a religion like any other religion. It's been influenced by, 1,500 years of culture and history and politics and all the other things that influence the great religions of the world. And that, like any religion, it's all about what you bring to it, not what you take from it. Um, and the book was written primarily, I mean, I have a very clear memory, like when I was writing this, it was for non-Muslims. And
mm,
then what was, I think, surprising about it is how it became a kind of manifesto for Muslims, particularly young Muslims, the so-called kind of, millennial Muslims, Muslims who had never really given their faith and their practice all that much thought, but then were bombarded by these outside noises about what their beliefs are, what they actually believe, both, from the two extremes on either side, and were desperate for someone to just simply say, this is the thing, this is the religion that you believe, and this is, where your ideas and your beliefs come from. And so, that was a real surprise to me, but it's been translated into, dozens of languages. It was a bestseller in India and in Pakistan. It's available in Iran. There's, Arabic translations of it. So it was, so it was nothing like I anticipated, and it was my first book, and so that was
yeah.
kind of a new experience for me as well. But I couldn't be more pleased with it. And then the other aspect of it that I thought was really unexpected is the way that it became a kind of guidebook for the American military.
Mm.
That I never thought was
Yeah, I
going
was
to
going to
be.
ask you about that. That because I heard that in your introduction to the new edition, and I thought, I'm going to ask him that.
Yeah, I honestly never in a million years that I anticipate that, but I cannot tell you how many vets have come up to me and said, your book was was required reading at West Point. Your book was required reading at the Air Force Academy. Like we all had to read it, and it changed everything about the way that I sort of understood the parameters of the conflict in my sort of role in it, and and diplomatic circles too. So, it's look, when you write a book, the best case scenario is that it does fairly well. You make a little bit of money, and after a few years, that's it. The book goes away.
That's it.
The
That's right.
idea that a book would remain in print for 20 years is in and of itself kind of a miracle. The idea that it's still selling so much that the publisher wants a new 20th anniversary edition, that is my wildest dreams. I never thought that would be a thing.
And just even the idea of, I mean, writing about religion is not exactly a recipe for, barn burning, bestseller sales, like,
Yeah, you said it.
right off the bat, right? And so, I mean, you think, okay, who's going to read this? Some scholars, some my colleagues at the different universities, and this thing takes off in a way that you never would have expected. Were there any unexpected negative impacts or after effects of writing this book? In other words, like, did you get accused of perhaps being the spokesman for? I mean, that's you just put a big load on your shoulders,
Yeah.
intentionally or unintentionally, right? Like you said, going on 2 billion adherents worldwide. Like, are you? That's a lot to carry. Talk us about. That's a lot to carry. Tell us about if you had any kind of pushback that was not positive.
Oh, yes, a lot. Look, turns out that, when you write about religion and politics and the intersection of the two, people tend to take those two things kind of seriously. Who knew?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, look, first of all, it's interesting that you talk about scholarship, because the biggest pushback and sort of the most negative response was from academia. And now I've come to understand this and accept it, and I think any academic who's had any kind of popular success will tell you the same thing, that it's the death of your career. You would think publishing a best-selling book would be good for your career, and it turns out no, it doesn't. I'm reminded of I think it's usually attributed to Kissinger, but the quote is something along the lines of, the politics of academia are so cutthroat because the stakes are so low. So
Yeah.
that was unusual. This book, in all seriousness, put an end to any kind of real academic career that I could have, pursued for myself, which is great, which is fine. It was a great reason to step off the academic cycle. And then obviously there was what you would expect, right? The right wing, and particularly the right wing Christian community, lambasted the book. It's all a bunch of lies. You're just a propagandist and an apologist. The conservative Muslim groups around the world hated the book because, it treats Muhammad like a human being who did human things. Right. It actually dares to suggest that maybe there's a level of historical context that might go into the interpretation of a religion, which, in certain corners is a crazy thing to say. But, I've had a very long career writing about religion. And so I've both gotten used to the extreme negative reaction that tends to come from it. And I've also gotten used to the delight that often comes when I hear from non-religious people, especially atheists, agnostics, people who have never given religion a second thought, who say that, my books and the way that I write about them in this kind of very reasonable but also compassionate way has made them completely rethink how they view religion and religious history and religious people. So, There's good and there's bad, as you can imagine.
And it's just this reflection about academia where if you write something that's popular and readable and enjoyable and thought provoking for
Heaven forbid.
the average not person who doesn't have a PhD in the topic like myself, that somehow that means that the work just isn't of value. That's just such an interesting thing because I had
Yeah.
on my notes, ask him how to write about a scholarly topic and make it interesting.
Ooh,
And
I
so,
love this question. I get it all the time, especially
yeah.
from, younger academics, people starting
Hmm.
their academic journey. The rest of your listeners may not find this interesting at all, but I love answering this question because I actually have the answer, which is it's twofold. Number one, scholarly writing, academic writing, it's all methodology. It's like 90% methodology. It's
Mm,
90%. Let me tell you what everybody who has ever thought anything about this topic has to say about it. And
mm,
then the other 10% is here's my thoughts about it.
mm.
And popular writing, you just flip that around.
Right.
90% is just what you think about it, and 10% is what other people have said about it. And maybe you even save that 10% for the end notes, you know? And then the
Wow.
second thing about it is that scholars learn facts, they learn data. And our job is to memorize those facts and that data and to regurgitate them. That's not how normal people learn. That's not
No.
how the general public learns. The general public learns through stories. You wrap your facts in storytelling, and they absorb those facts better than, honestly, than many scholars end up doing.
Yeah.
So dress your facts in stories and
Mm,
put the methodology in the end of the book. That's the main difference. That's how you
mm.
do it.
Interesting. So, yeah, because there's scene. I think it's at the start of your book where you're on a train in I think in
In
Morocco,
Morocco, yeah.
and yeah, and I read that scene. I'm like, this doesn't even feel like a scholarly book at this point, you know? And then I read your book, but I also listened to it because I on my commutes, and I thought, oh my God, I'm getting pulled into this whole thing. And so that's how you kicked it off, right? You kicked it off with a midnight ride and a quarrel in an adjoining train
Yeah,
car, and then you got to the some of the more factual stuff. So I found
that's
that
right.
so engaging.
That's right. Yes, I'm a scholar of religions. I have all the whatever the academic background for all of
Mm,
that. But first and foremost, I'm a storyteller. And I take that very seriously. I do a lot of different things, a lot of I wear a lot of hats, but really
yeah,
it's just one hat. And that hat is the hat of a storyteller because stories aren't just sort of entertaining tales that we tell ourselves. Stories are how we understand who we are and what our role is in an indeterminate world. History is just storytelling.
yeah.
Politics is just storytelling. Religion is just storytelling. That's what this is. And I think sometimes the concept of stories becomes devalued and even criticized, but certainly by academia. But I think of myself as a storyteller, and the stories that I tell are about the human condition. And some of them are historical, and some of them are religious, some of them are political, but fundamentally, it's just all story.
What do you think has changed in the last 2 decades about Islam? In other words, your students don't even they were barely born when 9/11 happened, for
That's right.
example, and so where the world has moved in different ways. Like, are the understandings different today than they were then?
Yeah, and it's certainly true that Islam has, it's no longer on the front pages of the newspapers. It's still there, but it's
Right.
not kind of top of mind the way that it was for so much of the 21st century here in the United States. I think what I would say is different now is that kind of where we began this conversation. The idea that whatever Islam is, it is nothing more than the negative pole for what the West is or what America is. That prevailing sentiment that was so robust, in the early 2000s, I don't see that in Gen Z at all, regardless of their political persuasion. Um, there's a simplisticness to that idea that is just simply not appealing to this generation anymore. They could be anti-Muslim. They could be very, religious. They could be evangelical. They could see Islam as both, a threat to their way of life and a threat to their faith. But that notion that whatever Islam is, it is quintessentially other. It is that thing which is not us. The primary issue that I was fighting against when I wrote this book, that doesn't seem to be a prevailing sentiment any longer. And frankly, that's kind of a big deal. I always say this, that I think sometimes we have this idea that bigotry is the result of ignorance. You hear it all the time, particularly, amongst, liberal intellectuals, that, oh, well, if you're prejudiced against a group or a people or whatever the case may be, then the answer to that is education. I'll just give you information and you'll stop being prejudiced. You'll stop being bigoted. But that's not true. Any psychologist will tell you that that's not true. Bigotry is not the result of ignorance. Bigotry is the result of fear. And fear is impervious to data. Fear is impervious to information. The only thing that can combat fear is relationships. And I think that however we define Gen Z and all of its problems, the one thing that they understand, because they came into this world, that a world that was already deeply interconnected, through internet, social media, and all of that. And so the sort of simplified demonization that comes from fear of the other isn't as prevalent in this generation as it was in, for instance, my generation.
Yeah. My generation. Yeah.
Yeah.
And perhaps one manifestation of that, myself having a daughter who just graduated from college, is really where you saw the reaction of colleges and universities to Israel-Palestine conflict, and just I don't know if the powers that be in the United States or Israel ever anticipated that was going to be a thing in the U.S., certainly on university campuses.
Even more fascinating was the response to those protests and sentiments from our generation. Because the response was almost universally, oh, these kids are ignorant. They don't really know the truth about Israel and Palestine, when the reality is that it's our generation that doesn't know the truth about Israel and Palestine, because we have been so cloistered that we have spent most of our adult lives having this information filtered through gatekeepers who were solely giving us the Israeli narrative. The truth of the matter is that those young people protesting on college campuses, they're the ones who actually know the truth and the facts about what is taking place in Israel, Palestine, because they are they're exposed to it. They're exposed to the reality of it without the media filter, without the media bias, without the political gatekeepers. They don't need those people to tell them what's happening over there. They can access it instantly themselves through internet and social media.
Yeah, it's a fascinating, and I have to profess my complete ignorance, at least in terms of, or lack of anticipation that was at all going to be a thing. My daughter's suddenly I started to get recommendations for podcasts from my daughter. Hey, listen to this, listen to that. And I'm following this guy on YouTube. And, as you say, none of it mainstream media, either from the left or the right in the United States.
That's right.
It was really interesting. As I think about and as I reflect back on your book, one of the things that was so fascinating to me that I did not really know anything about was the impact of the internet on what you might call kind of the most recent changes, evolutions, whatever you want to call them in Islam. Can you talk about that transition from, learned, gray-haired men kind of issuing, being the guide rails to the World Wide Web, for lack of a better term?
Yeah. No, this was probably, the most revolutionary part of No God But God was this foundational argument, which is that, people kept talking about, when is Islam going to have its reformation? Christianity has had its reformation. When is Islam going to have its reformation? And the argument of the book is, you are living in it. It's happening in front of you. Open your eyes and look around. And partly, I think that has to do with a fundamental misunderstanding of what Reformation means, right? I think when people think Reformation, they think, it's just this Christian phenomenon that happened, that there was this kind of argument between Protestant reform and Catholic intransigence, and the Protestants won. And so therefore, Christianity became this modern, pluralistic religion. And that's obviously not just historically false, but it fails to understand truly what Reformation is, which is a universal religious phenomenon. All great religious traditions have Reformation moments, because what Reformation truly means is an argument between the institutions of a faith and the individuals of that faith over who gets to define that faith. It's an argument about authority. Judaism had its own Reformation in the first century. Indeed, Christianity kind of came out of the Jewish Reformation, in which the rabbinic class individuals had this fundamental fight with the priestly class over which one of them gets to say what Judaism is. That argument, by the way, ended when the temple was burned to the ground by Rome. So that was a pretty easy win for the rabbinic class. In Christianity, same thing. This was fundamentally an argument over who gets to define what Christianity is. Is it the Pope, or is it the individuals who can access the scripture on their own? And that Reformation process has been taking place, as I argue in the book, for the last century, really, in Islam. Because for most of the first 1,400 years of Islam, the authority to define the meaning and message of this faith has rested exclusively in the hands of the clerical class, the schools of law, the institutions of Islam. And partly that has to do with the fact that they're the only ones who could actually access the Quran. But the sort of enormous improvements in education and literacy around the world, the ability to access the scripture in your own languages. The Quran has been translated into more languages over the last 50 years than it has in the previous 1,400 years combined. And of course, the internet, which I argue plays very much the same role in the Islamic Reformation that the printing press played in the Christian Reformation, in that it allows access to new ideas, new sources of knowledge, new sources of authority in a way that would have been inconceivable even, a few decades ago. And all of that has created a situation in which that authority that used to rest in the hands of clerical institutions now rests in the hands of everyone. Anyone, with access to the Quran and, a URL can become a source of authority in and of themselves. And yes, that can cause trouble, for sure. I mean, it always does. I mean, the Christian Reformation, the argument that sola scriptura, that any individual should be able to go to the scripture and read it and interpret it for themselves led to the 30 Years' War, in which half the population of Germany alone died. And so the same thing is happening with Islam. You're going to have these individualized interpretations that promote peace and tolerance and compassion and pluralism, and you're going to have individual interpretations that promote war and violence and bigotry and misogyny. And because there is no Islamic pope, right? There's no sort of centralized religious authority to say who's right and who's wrong. What you have is just this cacophony of voices fighting amongst each other over who gets to define the faith. And that is the Reformation. That's what's happening right here before our eyes.
Can you explain what a fatwa is?
Sure.
To our listeners? Because I had a completely I think totally biased impression of what it was. So if you can explain what that is, that was fascinating.
Yeah. I think for like a lot of people, the fatwa has taken on this specter of like a papal bull, like the divine command from like the representative God on earth, binding on all people of this faith. That's not what fatwa means. Fatwa is a juridical opinion. It's the opinion of a single Islamic cleric. And it has absolutely no binding authority on anyone except the individual followers of that particular cleric. I think some people who might be more familiar with Judaism might understand how authority in Islam works, right? As with Judaism, there is no temple, there's no priesthood, right? There's no Jewish pope, right? It's just learned, mostly men, of authority who use their learning to make declarative judgments about how to live as a Jew. And then you as a Jew can either choose to follow those judgments or not. There's no enforcement mechanism for that. And that's the same is true with a fatwa. These are just individual clerics. They have an opinion, and then they release those opinions in the form of a fatwa.
Because I grew up in the era of Salman Rushdie, satanic verses, and I always thought that fatwa was like a there's a bounty on your head, kind of thing, and then go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say so. In that case, of course, that fatwa came from the Ayatollah Khomeini,
right?
Who, again, there are clerics and there are clerics, right?
Right.
And one cleric has 50 followers.
Heavy duty cleric. Yeah.
And one cleric has 5 million followers.
Right.
And so, the specter of that fatwa, I think the reason it got the attention that it got is because of who issued it.
Okay.
But the thing about fatwas is that everyone's got a dozen fatwas. Like you give me a fatwa on any subject, literally any subject, give me 24 hours, I'll find you a fatwa that argues the exact opposite of that subject. That's how it goes,
It's interesting. I interviewed a surgeon who's a worldwide leader in transplant from animals to humans, heart transplants. And so the animal that is easiest to grow the heart and to match the human chest cavity and to genetically modify the heart is a pig. And of course, he's Muslim and grew up in Pakistan. And so we talked about this whole wrestling with that,
right.
Could he even touch the pig and the whole thing? And so he said, yeah. And I went to a cleric and he issued a ruling, is the way he put it to me. And I thought,
that's a fatwa.
And so that must be what that was. So I think this idea of these competing opinions, right? Give me 24 hours and I'll find a separate opposing viewpoint on something. It's fascinating to me. And then as someone who's just learning about this, I say, so what does that say about the future of Islam?
It's a great question, because it used to be that if you wanted a fatwa, that guy, let's talk about your physician.
Yeah.
He needs a fatwa. He needs a cleric to tell him whether he can or cannot do what he's doing. So he goes to his mosque, or he goes to, maybe he goes to some great, cleric with, dozens of years of learning. Maybe he goes all the way to Egypt and goes to Al-Azhar, the oldest university in the world, the sort of one of these the eminent institutions of Islam. And he finds a cleric, and the cleric says, yes, you can get a pig's heart if you're a Muslim, and that's okay, and here's my fatwa. Great. Nowadays, you don't even need to do that. Why would you go all the way to Egypt when you can just go to fatwaonline.com and just they have a fatwa database of tens of thousands of fatwas. Go to the search engine and punch in pig heart transplant, and you're going to get 14 fatwas. 7 of them are going to say it's okay. 7 of them are going to say it's not okay. Pick the one you like. This is what is happening right now in the world. And so you're right to sort of recognize that and think to yourself, holy cow, well, then what comes next? And it's hard to say. But what is important to note is that this isn't new. This is how it's always been. It's just that now the access is so much easier for anyone. And you can kind of pick and choose. In the old days, you'd go to your mosque, and the guy would issue a fatwa saying, no, you're not allowed to use pig hearts. And then you would just be like, okay, I'm going to go to a different mosque. And you go to a different mosque, and that guy would say it's okay. But now, again, what do you need the mosque for? If all you need is an internet connection.
Does this level the playing field for women, for example? And perhaps, people who weren't sitting in those circles of white-haired men with beards.
Yes, indeed. What we have been seeing over the last 3 or 4 decades is this newly muscular Islamic feminism that is no longer just simply about trying to create a feminist interpretation of Islam. It's instead seizing the power that men have monopolized to define the religion for centuries, and seizing that power for themselves and declaring themselves imams. And indeed, the sort of female imam, this kind of movement that we're seeing all over the world, not just in the U.S. and North America and in Europe, but in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Pakistan, in India, in these sort of very traditionally Muslim countries, is extraordinary. It's, I think, probably the most exciting movement taking place within Islam is this new source of authority that is fully female, right? Women who are being trained by women, who are training other women, who are issuing fatwas focused solely on issues concerning women instead of relying on centuries of male-dominated interpretations.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thing to think about. The future is going to be, it's being written every day.
Yeah, and to just connect it to what we were just saying 5 minutes ago. So imagine this, okay? So you are a 19-year-old Muslim woman in Egypt, in Cairo, and maybe you don't have access to a female imam. You don't know one. There's no one around you, right? It's a very male-dominated society. So what? Again, get online.
There's online.
15 female imams in New York that you have access to, and they can be your spiritual source of authority. And that's brand new. That is absolutely brand new.
It's just flattened everything and cut down those barriers. It's really interesting. You've been very generous with your time, and I do have an eye on the clock, but I wanted to see, I have one more question for you, but before we get there, is there anything that I have not mentioned about about your book, about your other work, where people can find you that you'd like to mention?
No, I've 3 years ago deleted all of my social media and have never been happier. So,
Good.
so I'm unreachable in that regard. But obviously you
Good.
can go to rezaaslan.com and get in touch with me. No problem at all.
And you've written widely, and so folks can check out your presence online with that, and buy the book. It's fascinating if you have not yet read it. I did have a final question for you. It's a hypothetical, but if you had the power or the ability or the resources, whatever, to design and publish a billboard on the side of the freeway, and folks are going to read it going by at 70 miles an hour, or depending on where you live, they might be going by at 7 miles an hour if you're a Southern California person. What does your billboard say to the world about what you find to be important?
Wow, that's a really, really good question. I don't know how well this would fit on a billboard, but it would be something along the lines of, stop confusing yourself for God. God doesn't root for your football team. God doesn't hate what you hate. God doesn't love what you love. You're talking about yourself. You're not talking about God. God, if God exists, is about as far from you and your personality and characteristics and interests and concerns as it could possibly get. And you know what? That's a good thing. Maybe that billboard would work in Los Angeles because there's, we're all driving at like 3 miles an hour.
That's right. You just described several billboards, so we're going to have a serial billboard. But thank you so much for that. I think that's a fitting coda for today's conversation. It's been a real honor chatting with you, and congratulations again on the success of your work and having it, as you say, endure and gain new life after 2 decades, which is really any author's best hope and dream, really.
Thank you, David. It was a real pleasure being on the show.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us on the Hangout Podcast. You can send us an email at podcastinfo@proton.me. Many thanks to my daughter Maya for editing this episode. I'd also like to underline that this podcast is entirely separate from my day job, and as such, all opinions expressed herein are mine and mine alone. Thanks for coming on in and hanging out.